Hello, how you doing? This is Josh Kulp. This is, as you know, the video for Daf Shevui. We're learning Masechet Avodah Zarah. We are on page 34, Daf Lamed Dalet, and this is another preview video. We'll talk a little bit about the material that you're going to learn this week. The Gemara is in the midst of going through a Mishnah that talks about all sorts of objects, foods that are prohibited to derive benefit from them. Right? To remind ourselves, there's distinctions in Jewish law between things that you can't eat. A prime example would be pig. You are not allowed to eat pig, but you can derive benefit from it. That's why you can toss around the old pigskin, although they don't make footballs from pigskins anymore, so I hear. And then there are things that you're prohibited to derive any benefit from them. Those include things that are involved in idol worship. They include basar bechalav, meat and milk cooked together, blood prohibitions, and various other prohibitions as well. I don't want to get into all of them, but it's a helpful distinction to what we call isur hana'ah and Isur Achila. Isur Hana'ah is prohibited to derive benefit, and Isur Achila is prohibited to eat, a lesser prohibition. You can sell it, give it to your dogs, etc. So the first sugya continues to talk about koshering vessels, and that talks about the glazed earthenware vessels some more. It talks about Pesach koshering, which we have to be a little bit more stringent for, because assumedly the vessels that were koshering to eat on Pesach were used with hot food previously, and therefore if they're earthenware vessels, they can't be koshered, at least glazed earthenware vessels. But if they were used with wine, wine is drunk cold, and therefore you can kosher it in various ways that the Gemara discusses. The Gemara then moves on to talk about the seeds and the pits of grapes when they are moist and when they are dry. So when they're moist, they're prohibited, and when they're dry, they're permitted. I would say that probably moist ones are more similar to wine, and therefore the wine prohibitions apply, and dry ones are no longer similar to wine, and therefore the prohibitions do not apply. Then we move on to talking about various forms of fish brine. And it seems an interesting thing we learned in the Gemara is that wine was put in there to cover up some of the taste or maybe the lack of the fat of the less tasty, less fatty, less good fish brine. And therefore experts who are making the really good stuff, the really good murias or fish brine, they don't need to put wine in there, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. So that really the issue is, when are you concerned that people are going to put wine into their dishes to cover up the taste? And maybe today we use certain spices to cover up the taste, or salt, and maybe some sugar can sort of smooth out some of the bad flavors that might be in certain foods. And then we move on to a discussion, and we're going to get more into discussion of this later on, of various types of cheese prohibitions. The first one is called Gvinat Beit Onyaki, a place called Athenian or some name like that. And the answer is there they used most calves were used in idol worship. And since you can't derive benefit from products that were involved in idolatry, so therefore their cheese is prohibited. Don't worry about the cheese prohibition, because we're going to come back to that later on when we talk about regular cheese, not this special cheese from Onyeki. And then finally, the Gemara ends with a discussion of the non-flesh parts of prohibited animals. Particularly, the two issues that are addressed here are rennet and dung. Rennet would be used in the cheese-making process, and dung would be used in fertilizing. Do they count as part of the animals? It's sort of like a definitional question. Does the rennet and the dung, does that count as if it's their flesh? We know that their flesh we can't use, but what about other parts that are non-fleshy parts? Sometimes questions might be asked about things like hair, fingernails. Do the prohibitions of the animal or of the human being apply to them as well? So the Gemara in the end makes a distinction between other types of prohibitions. For instance, an animal that was sentenced to be stoned, an ox that gores a human being is supposed to be stoned, and you can't benefit from its flesh, or you can't eat its flesh and derive any benefit from it, or And a distinction between those kinds of animals, or let's say another type would be sacrificial animals from which you're not allowed to derive benefit, and Avodah Zarah animals, idolatrous animals used in idolatry. The laws are more prohibitive when it comes to animals that were involved in idolatry, and animals that are simply prohibited to derive benefit from them, such as sacrificial animals or an animal that was sentenced to be stoned. You can use their flesh parts. So that's a little bit of a preview of the daf. It's a little choppy, I'll admit, a bunch of different sugiot, but I hope you enjoy it. And as always, please continue to make comments, ask questions on our Facebook daf Shevui page. Good luck.